You are all there connected online. We can see you connecting. Thank you. Just a quick heads up if you can hear as well. I see remote participants noting, so we will kick off. So I'm very happy to move to the next session. This is a session that connects to our theme on Monday. This is the Core Human Need Shelter. It's been a wonderful day because for us, shelter as core human need, addressing that core human need with the disruptive supply chain that is aligned with the 1.5 of the Paris Agreement, but also with the SDGs, open up the agenda for development. And this is a very positive agenda, and shelter, of course, is at the heart of the 11 billion people that are demanding flourishing life for 2050. This session is entitled Assessing Avoid Emissions and 1.5 Global Sustainability Compatibility from Shelter Solutions, the Role of Nature and Bits in Replacing Bricks. So that is a really sexy title for the session, but I really would like to stress that this is a series of 1.5 Global Sustainability series. This particularly will be focusing on shelter, but we are really thrilled to see how these series are connecting to all core human needs. So thank you, Dennis, from Mission Innovation Rise, to put the fantastic panels and for the curation of the same. And I will pass and hand over the floor to Dennis for the moderation. Dennis, thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you, Carlos. This is probably the strangest session I'm going to moderate during this COP because it's about shelter, and most people think housing, the beautiful bamboo buildings we saw just in the session before. Here we have a very different session because we have some of the best data experts, but we also have two companies that many people might not associate with building shelter. If you look at it from a very shallow point, you have one sportswear company and one that is selling lawn mower basically and cutting grass. But that's not really true. And as we move into the need to really rethink cities and shelter, we actually have one company that is providing green spaces and another company that is reconnecting people with nature. And looking around at this COP, we have basically 30 degrees plus outside, but still we have it here so that people walk around as if it is 16, 15 degrees. Why aren't people walking in shirts and shorts? Why aren't we closer to nature rather than trying to push nature away and making everything sounds the same? So there's so many things around here. When you think about shelter, it's also about human perception and preferences. How do we dress? How do we interact with nature? Is it okay to be sweaty at a conference, or does it have to be chilly instead? So these things, of course, if we try to solve it by technology and pushing things in, or having another way. And that's sort of the theme of this, is really dig deeper into the idea of what kind of data do we need to rethink? Because today in the area of shelter, you have lots of data on the per square meter or square foot emissions or energy efficiency, etc., but very little on the human element, how human wants to live and be. So that's really what we're going to focus on here. And if you can switch on I'm just going to do a short introduction. Can you switch to my slides? So next slide. So basically, the idea of this session is I do a short introduction, then Erik gonna present a little bit on really what I think is very little known ideas about data science and transformative system change and what happens then. And then we'll have two cases with two exciting companies or stakeholders providing smart solutions. And then Catherine will end by having some reflections as one of the sort of leading data scientists around of climate and carbon. to reflect on this session. And then, depending on how much time we have left, a bit of a discussion. So, yeah. So there you have the eminent panelists. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to provide a bit of a context to why we do this. And for many people, I would say that we're still in the area of 90s thinking. Back in the 90s, back when Kyoto, back when much of this climate discussion was started, the idea was to reduce the emissions by 5% in the rich countries. So the tools and the thinking and the approach is still there. So basically the big emitters tweaking their systems and reducing their emissions. Fantastic. The challenge we have now post-Paris is that we're looking at the future where 11 billion people in the future should be able to live good life. As some of you might know, tomorrow marks the day when we reach 8 billion people on this planet, statistically. We don't exactly know, of course, but tomorrow is the day when we move in only 11 years from 7 to 8 billion people. So that's another billion people now on the planet the last 10 years. And that's what we need to focus on, because most of the people on this planet do not have shelter in a good way. Some people in the West have too much or lots of problems in those. But the main challenge moving forward is really looking at Asia and Africa, where 80% of the population will live. How do we ensure that we have sustainable solutions there? Next slide, please. And the reason for this session is, of course, that we're also moving into this new phase. The fourth industrial revolution, the post-industrial society, the knowledge society, the experience society, whatever people call it. But basically during 100 years, society didn't change that much after industrialization kicked in, when we moved from agriculture. But as we now move to the digital world, the idea of what we can and is able to do is fundamentally different. And we haven't really adopted that. So most country strategies now, it's still based on improving the old systems. Transportation is a perfect example. People say, how can we get fossil-free cars? That is not the right question. The question is, how do we get access and move around society? And we can get access virtually with 3D printers, with drones, with walkability, bikes, so many new things. But we build our cities around the assumptions that we live in this sort of square little space and we have access to a car. This was sort of the idea on how it looked like. That is no longer true. And for me, that is also when we think about cities and buildings. You remember before COVID, the idea of an office was a physical place. Now, an office is a laptop or an iPad. You can work wherever you want. And then, of course, you might have a meeting space, but the idea of an office is now fundamentally changed. What if we think about shelter in the same way? Next slide, please. And that's what we really want to introduce this idea, and the work with Masamba, Carlos, Sylvia, and others in the Global Innovation Hub with this expanded innovation agenda, to not focus on existing sectors, but focus on human needs. So if someone says climate challenge, ask them, how do we provide for human needs in a sustainable way? Not how do we reduce emissions from the old sectors? Because that's not really the core focus here. The core focus is how do we give people what they need? And don't only focus on the big emitters, focus on those who can provide the solutions. So let's bring the solution agenda in. I would actually like if the UNFCCC, instead of having an implementation focus, would have a solution focus. Because when we talk about implementation, for most people, that is still about reducing emissions from old sectors. Next slide, please. And that's where we are now with cities. Most cities so far have approached the climate challenge as a reduction agenda. They have developed strategies to reduce their own emissions and have staff that is focusing on accounting and calculating and reducing emissions. That is not bad. That's great that they have done that. That's the 90s agenda. 2020, next slide please. That is about a rethinking. It's not about a small team trying to reduce emissions in the city. Now it's the whole city trying to provide for human needs in a sustainable way and also be a global stakeholder. I don't care if Stockholm claims to be zero carbon. or any other city around the world. I happen to come from Stockholm. I want to make sure that cities also are exporting the solutions and importing to help the next generation of solution providers to drive this, and that the solutions they provide is not zero carbon, but compatible, resource efficient enough to allow for 11 billion people to live flourishing lives. Because most people in the West now, most cities, have a strategy that is way too resource intensive to allow Africa and Asia to move out of poverty. And we don't talk about that enough because we have a carbon tunnel vision, only looking at the need for reducing emissions. And you can be very creative with claiming carbon emission reductions. Many companies buy offsets and be very creative, not asking if their core business is really 1.5 compatible. Next slide, please. So that's really what I want to zoom in on today, is that what we talk about here is a core human need. If you don't have protection for your body, for the temperature, weathers that are, rain, sand, whatever you have around you, you are unprotected. But you also need light to be able to study, to learn. You need heating to take care of your health. So the buildings are providing you with different things. But it's not just buildings. You can control your temperature with putting on a sweater instead, or taking off a sweater, depending on how you do things. So it's really about looking at what are the underlying needs and who can provide those. And a building, if it's next to green space or have green on top, can control the temperature much better. So we shouldn't think about the old way of industrial thinking with technology solutions only, but more holistic approaches and saying, how do people live good lives in these cities? So, and that's also why these companies are involved. Next slide, please. Because this is a new generation of purpose-driven companies that we have seen now, that is not just looking at reducing the problem for themselves, but delivering the solutions for society. And that is a new generation of companies that we still do not address enough. Last slide, please. And that's really where we come together to bring, next slide, where the different stakeholders, because we need the solution, next, then the solution providers, oh sorry, you're one behind. Yeah, there we go. So we need to link the different stakeholders, and what I think is exciting here is that we have two leading companies that are really solution providers, but more than that, they also help reshape our thinking on what a city is and what can be done, but also data experts, because they are as much enablers as anyone else. And I would like to see the next COP basically dedicating a full day to data exclusively and say, what kind of data are we getting today? Who is owning it? How do we process it? So it's human needs driven. Because most companies today, we have a horrible situation where actually most companies now collect data just to sell more to you. And it doesn't matter if it's Google, Facebook, Amazon. Those are driving by just selling more stuff to you. They're not really driven by giving you a better life. They are trying, they're doing some progress, but still today, most of the data is gathered not to help you live better lives, but to sell you more things. So we really need to question who's getting this data. Who's processing this data? Because the question of data ownership will be one of the major issues also moving forward. So with that, I'd like to end and introduce Erik, who I came across when we were preparing for Digital with Purpose Summit, and we were looking for some of the best people really understanding the next generation of data thinking. And bear with me, these slides that he probably will show are quite complicated, but if you remember something from this COP, this is one of those complicated things that I hope you will carry with you and maybe study a bit closer, because it's about transformation and the limits of current ways of thinking around data. Erik, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Dennis. And everyone can hear me? Good audio? Okay, perfect. I will share my slides, and I hope you can see that now. And we'll go into full screen mode. Okay, so if there's a problem, just let me know, but I'll assume that the technology is working for us. So thank you, Dennis, for the introduction. I very much agree with the holistic approach and the idea that some innovations may come from very low-tech ways of thinking, which could be viewed in some ways as really, kind of a radical paradigm shift. Could we solve big problems through simple solutions? And so what I'd like to present today, based on our previous conversations, Dennis, is this idea that's emerging in data science right now about where and how we might be able to look for sort of radically new ways of understanding using the data that we have available even already, but by projecting it in new and different ways. So I'm calling this, where do new bits come from anyways, if we think that bits can actually have something to do with replacing bricks in a shelter context. And maybe more formally, I'll say there's automating knowledge discovery with our existing computational systems. So we'll call this the edge of chaos. This is an idea that really has something to do with this theory of phase transitions, which is a very deep, elegant, rigorous, beautiful theory that emerged over the last 100 or 150 years in the physical sciences, in theoretical physics and experimental physics. But what we've seen over time is that this theory of phase transitions is not really limited to material substances or to physical phenomena. It actually applies to a much broader class of dynamical systems, including psychological systems, sociological systems. And what I'm showing here is just a couple of graphics to give you an impression that at these phase transitions, so for example, between the transition between water and ice, or water and steam, or other exotic materials out there, you often see a very similar kind of pattern, behavior, profile, and I'm just trying to indicate that here with a few graphics. I'm also listing some research that has been done over the years that either I participated in or was of interest and inspiration to me. But the idea is that between ordered and disordered dynamics, that boundary, that phase transition, is not just a boundary, but it's a source of rich and complicated ongoing dynamics. And there's sort of this balance between regularity and surprise. And I realize this is all very abstract, so let me just give you an example about how we applied this in a data science context. And so we were interested in some biomedical questions. We were interested in gene-disease interactions or associations in particular. And so what we had done is developed a dictionary of about 700,000 biomedical concepts. So these are things like genes, diseases, symptoms, biological processes, etc. And we used that dictionary of controlled terminology to then index a very large database of biomedical literature. So more than 17 million publications from 1980 onwards. And with that indexing, we were able to compute something called mutual information. This is the amount of information that is associated between two concepts. And that's a technical issue, but the idea was that we were able to build up a conceptual graph, a big graph of concepts related to concepts that were each of the edges were weighted by this mutual information. So we had a very large, complicated knowledge graph, we would say. But by using this idea of the edge of chaos and phase transitions, we were able to project that graph in such a way that we could see a classic percolation type phase transition on that knowledge graph. And there's no time here to really explain this in detail, but it's to say that we have on the one side of this transition, sort of newer concepts, newer ideas that were sort of underconnected in the graph. On the other side of the transition, we had concepts and concept associations that were very well established already in the literature. So this is really kind of established knowledge, or like textbook knowledge. This is the kind of things that we just take for granted nowadays. But at the border between the established knowledge and these newer concepts coming in some cases, there would be this this spike in mutual information, and we have reasons to believe that it's at this transition point where new associations, very high in their mutual information, are potentially new discoveries. And I'm showing that with the inset on the right side of the screen, where we are able to use these techniques to follow the trend in the mutual information between, say, genes and diseases that sometimes are trending years before they're actually discovered by human beings and published in the literature. So we were working out ways to basically automate the discovery of new gene-disease associations. Now, that being said, this is a pretty limited, very technical, kind of focused approach, but I think the question we might want to consider today, and I saw the theory of change on the Global Innovation Hub website. The question might be, can we actually harness these edge of chaos techniques, these very broad general class of approaches, to help us stimulate or generate the need-based or solution-oriented approaches that Dennis was talking about at the beginning. And I'll leave it there for now. That's my introduction, but I look forward to the discussion later on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. That's a fantastic presentation. And just to people understand, this is really about how we think about things. We used to think about climate as a reduction agenda. We created data to improve, optimize existing systems. If we shift the perspective to human needs, everyone on the planet and solutions, that's a new paradigm. That's all sorts of new data and thinking that comes into that. And so much of our data sets today are sort of focused on increased reliability of those data, but the validity, the meaning of that data is being reduced because society is changing and the different paradigm is emerging. So we will have a session tomorrow with OECD, for instance, about the need for human connections when transformations happens. You can't build databases to just pour data over people and expect them to change. There's also human elements to transition phase. But we're trying to optimize things. We try to use the kind of tools we have for the old industrialization, the things that sell us stuff today as consumers that are simplistic and possible to manipulate. But if you want to bring people on board as citizens, there's new ways of tools and thinking around that. So, and Erik is also doing amazing work. I don't know if you heard that about Go Fair, which is all about making data accessible and free and available. And also we're discussing now how can we make a human face on that. And I realize now that I introduced Erik as Erik, and now we'll introduce Erik also. But we move from Erik Schultes to Erik Swan. Even Erik S doesn't help. So. But Erik Swan now, who for me is also one of these fantastic people who's really trying to rethink and is at the center of data, because the work he's doing is really about using AI to help cities to plan for green spaces. So Erik, the floor is yours. Erik Swan, I should say, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. So great to be here. And you talked about the good life. I think that's something we're all longing for and needing, sort of. And the agenda for COP and everything now is climate change, and it's about change. And I'm really like this half full glass kind of guy, like crazy positive. And perhaps we can really direct this change into also including the good life. We all have to change, so why not change into something good? So hopefully we can do that with the help of data, doing data-informed decisions. And I can see I get some help with my slides here. Thanks for that. And if you want, we could wait with this just a few minutes. We could head back to that if possible. Thank you. And my name is Erik Swan. As introduced, I'm working with digital exploration and digital innovation for Husqvarna Group, a global manufacturer of outdoor power tools and gardening equipment. So how does lawnmowers and chainsaw and the irrigation system fit into this discussion, you may ask? And for me, there's a natural connection, so to say. And as you know, urbanization is happening. And today, United Nations says that around 55% of the Earth population are living in cities. In 2050, it's projected to be 68%. So this is really happening now, and cities are at the pinnacle and the point where climate change are starting to hurt already now, and that will keep on hunting them for the years to come, I would say. And with this session focusing on avoiding emissions from shelter, I actually want to move outside of the shelter, perhaps if we define the shelter as the building. And how can the surroundings affect emissions from buildings? I will tell you a bit about how. And my focus is, of course, the green infrastructure, the vegetation, trees, grass, and bushes of the cities. And vegetation is also part of the shelter, if you ask me. And one big challenge for cities across the globe already now is heat stress. And with the changing climate, that will likely affect even more cities and people in the coming years. So I found some interesting facts when preparing for this talk around this topic, and I will share some slides with you. So please, if you can share, that would be perfect. And while waiting for that, some of these numbers comes from the recent report from Lancet, Countdown on Health and Climate Change. Really interesting reading if you want to read up on that. And in that report, they are closely connecting lack of green areas to poor health and also to energy and carbon emissions. And 1 billion people in low and middle income countries that is exposed to heat stress do not have any indoor cooling or air conditioning. In the same study, Lancet says that the number of installed air conditioning units globally has increased by 66% in the last 20 years. And we can wait with the next until later. So there we are. And the electricity demand for air conditioning increases with approximately 1 to 9% for each 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature, according to the EPA, United States Environmental and Protection Agency. And often this electricity is produced with CO2 emissions. And actually, according to the International Energy Agency, IEA, air conditioning is responsible for 0.9 gigatons of CO2 emissions yearly. A lot of sources now. The EPA, again, states that mortality rates may increase up to 5% for every 1 degree centigrade that increase in temperature. So lots of data connected to urban heat islands and the distress in cities, affecting pollution, affecting the life expectancy and health of people, but also direct emissions. And as most big challenges, they also have many layers in the solution. And of course, that's also the case here. So perhaps we can move into the next slide. And as many researchers conclude, one significant part of the solution here is to make use of nature-based solution. And as green areas cool down the cities and the buildings and the people living in the cities. And with the shade and shelter the trees provide, urban areas, they are cooler, and buildings do not need air conditioning to the same extent. So there are recommendations right now from the World Health Organization of 9 square meters green space per capita in cities, and that sufficient green areas should be accessible within 300 meters from where people live. That's a great and very good ambition, but probably not enough. I believe that to make an impact for cities in terms of heat stress, much more green areas is needed, and that is should be really close to where people are living and spending time to make sense. So the question is more green areas a luxury or is it a necessity? Well, here we know that it's not only a question about the average income in the country also large and wealthy cities in the global north still suffer from too little green space and from urban heat stress. And according to the same report from Lancet, they state that only 27% of urban centers was classified as moderately green or more, being able to cope and reduce the effect of heat stress. So it's a global challenge. And I would say it's more about prioritization and planning than actual access to fund the money. Even that's also a challenge. So more green areas is an investment with a great ROI. And to help cities greening, we at Husqvarna has developed Hugsy.green, the tool you talked about, Dennis, the Husqvarna Urban Green Space Index. And every year we are monitoring global cities using satellites to assess the current greenness. And with the data, cities can track the development and benchmark with other relevant cities. And cities are getting greener, we can see that. And the vitality and health of vegetation is also improving. And one important factor to achieve this energy savings is to take more care of and plant more trees. And the global benchmark for cities right now is 25% tree canopy cover. But of course that differs a lot from the individual cities. So there are a lot of data available to really make comprehensive plans in how to improve. And if you want, you can close the sharing down. And just to conclude, green is multifunctional. And green areas could be the living room for people in dense cities. We don't have to live as big as today. Buildings can also house green space with green roofs, green walls, trees integrated into it. With more green areas, we can let people grow food close to where they live. It could be truly multifunctional. And the green areas also help us to manage the other challenges with climate change, like extreme weathers, with stormwater and flooding. That can be handled. And of course, with that, disease and death rates, as well as mental health of people, is reduced and improved by spending more time in the green. So overall, building resilient cities and communities with more green. And you can see that the ROI for investing in green cities is truly great. So hopefully we can build the good life from greener cities together with data like that. So thanks for listening, and continue looking forward to the dialogue after this.
Thanks a lot, Erik. This is such an interesting question for me in terms of these three levels, that you directly can just reduce emissions by just putting grass on it or putting on a sweater, but you can also start thinking long term in terms of how do, as Erik ended by saying, how big do we need to live? If we live in a comfortable environment where we walk outside, meet other friends, play and have fun with each other, reconnect with nature. But also more fundamentally, what kind of lives are we living? Are we living with friends, enjoying life, science, art, or are we sitting with our devices, trying to be consumers, being fooled by people who just want to sell us things? Those are very fundamental questions. So these three layers in terms of direct impact, longer term opportunities, but also more fundamental questions about what is a good human life. And with that, I'd like to introduce Gustav from Houdini, who's very much in this space and who's a company who's been talking about own only to bring 10 garments. Think about how much you really need. A company who's giving their employees 1 day extra if they go by train instead of flying to their vacation. Something that Gustav have become a poster boy for. And these kind of new thinkings, that is really about rethinking. Do we need to fly? Or do we think then, how do we make it better an airplane? Or do we ask ourselves, maybe we don't need an airplane, maybe we can take a vacation by train and enjoy life better. So Gustav, could you share some of these things in terms of Houdini's thinking and reconnecting with nature and these relations that, building on what Erik said? Thank you, Dennis, and thanks for the kind words.
I can start with the 10 garments. We did a 10 garment challenge this summer. So we invited people to only use 10 garments for the entire summer. I was part of that challenge, and I'm still in one of my 10 garments. I might add 5 more, so I have 15 during the whole year. But I'm trying to stay with those 15 garments. And I have to say, I really agree with Erik Swan. Like, how can we create a good life? At Houdini, we call it, how can we have a maximum experience? Because I think that's really a good point when we look forward. Like, what should we do? How can we imagine the consumer society we have today? But going back, so my name is Gustav. I work with innovation, controlling, project management, and like everyone at Houdini, I'm responsible for sustainability. And I will shortly start about Houdini and then go on to data and the lifestyle we're looking to create. We're a progressive outdoor company based in Stockholm, Sweden. And in the vision and in the heart of the company, we believe that nature has an intrinsic value regardless of the human needs. But our industry and many industries in general don't agree. Somewhere between 80 billion and 150 billion garments are produced and sold every year. And 60% of those garments are thrown into waste within 1 year. So it's the perfect example of take, make, and waste industry. And that has led us in the world that we are overshoot. Currently 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries are in overshoots. I hope you all know that, but otherwise I'm sad to share it. At Houdini, we instead believe in a flourishing half-Earth society for all. And at Houdini, we call that forward to nature, that we want to give back to nature. We want to be a part of nature. And together with Rise and Mission Innovation, we have been trying to quantify this into actual data. And we've been using a formula, which is P, that's for the product, and V, which is for the volume, and then L for the lifestyle. And those together are the total impact that we as a company, but also as a person, has on the planet. And if you exemplify this with Houdini, for us, P, okay, what's the incentives, or what are we trying to create with the product? We have at the moment 80%, 100% circular products. That means that we can use the same materials over and over again instead of taking new resources. And we offer rental, reuse, and repair, so we can avoid using new materials when we can repair what we have. And when it comes to V, I talked about the 10 garment challenge. Imagine if everyone, especially in the, I don't like the word, but developed world or north, if we only use 10 garments for the entire year, or let's say 15 to not make it too hard. And when we look at our users, we ask them, how many times have you used this product and how long are you planning to use it? And they claim to be using one of our hoodies for 1,287 times before buying a new hoodie. And imagine that, like, avoided materials that we haven't used when we have a behavior like that, which we are immensely proud of. And when it goes on to lifestyle, so we looked at the product, we looked at the volume that we produce or use, but also what's the lifestyle we want to create. Erik called it the good life, and this is like something we try to achieve and think about every day, because how can we strive to make people reconnect to nature? How can we make people fall in love with nature? How can we want people to care about nature? And sometimes, like, I look forward to a really bad day, because then I know I can use my jacket I really like. Even if I'm commuting to work with bike, I still like, oh yeah, I got to use my jacket or my 100% wool pants, which are waterproof, because it's like, this is cool innovation. How can we make people want to be in nature even if it's bad weather, which one could say it's nice weather? And how can we make people not, for example, take in the car and wanting to go outside? But it's not only about like we produce product, of course, but like what's the communication we share with our followers or in all the sessions we are. For example, we would never have heli skiing in one of our commercials. Then we would prefer to promote ski touring. But also, if we look beyond the kind of the user and the product we produce, what's the lifestyle we as a company promotes? For example, when we do new innovations, we always do it open source. So when we launched a fleece hoodie that doesn't share microfibers, we share that open source. And going back to Erik Schultes, like what's the kind of, how can we find progress with a wider, like maybe not within the industry, but across industries. But we as a company also realize the enormous challenge with urbanization, because cities offer less nature, less experience, and we're gotten used to having dirty water that we can't swim in. Like Dennis, you said you live in Stockholm, so do I. And sometimes the water in Stockholm, which is supposed to be a really like a clean city, it's not a good place to swim in, which is just crazy. And we're gotten used to like the noisy town full of cars and airplanes passing by. And then of course it's easier to stay in and like watch your screen, or when you go somewhere you want to shelter yourself into your car instead of going or biking. And if you never heard a bird sing or insects fly or never see them, like why would you care about if they disappear? And for us as an outdoor company, that's really like terrifying, because if no one wants to go outside, well then we don't exist. If people stay inside, there's no need for Houdini clothes, more or less. And kind of sad final note, what we see is that the people who are living like closest to nature, who are not part of a big city that can protect them from nature, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most. So I really, really hope that we can contribute to something good today, and a kind of new approach, because what we're doing today is apparently not working. But thank you for the time, and sorry for the sad words.
Thank you, Gustav. I think for many people, when I talk about companies, I'm an NGO by background. Many people see problems. Companies greenwashing, companies not taking things serious. And then all of a sudden you hear companies who's totally rethinking. What is it to be a company? What is it that is meaningful? How do we strengthen people? Not just try to sell them more stuff. And as Gustav was saying, and for me, when I listen to Erik from Husqvarna and Gustav from Houdini, like, why aren't they in the center of the city planning discussion? Because now we build, it's luxury to have a walk-in closet. Why should you have a walk-in closet? It's an overconsumption. It's basically, if you have an idea of just trampling down on the planet, if that's the image you get, and also as Gustav was saying, if you dress and take a walk with nature, if it's okay to wear other kind of clothing, where nature is not something that you're opposed to, that you don't need air conditioning and protection all the time. To feel rain in your face is not a bad thing. To feel sun in your face is not something that is bad. And that's sort of rethinking the whole idea of us as human beings also. And then of course, as Gustav also said, at the same time, there are people who need genuine protection, especially in the global south now, for climate change. At the same time, we have people who are overprotected in the north, that is not connecting to nature, that is not feeling what is actually happening, and that is also living lives that is only about consumption. So in the same way as I have challenged when it comes to yesterday's session about nutrition, we have people having too little food many places in the world, but also a large proportion have way too much food. So we have this dual society, and the same thing with shelter. We are overprotected in many places of the world where we have too much shelter and shelter from too much. At the same time, we have too little for too few things in other parts of the world. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Catherine, who's been helping in the first generation of carbon data and now leading the thinking of the next generation. But also this tension, we've been in a few calls with people who are maybe not including this kind of perspective in the data gathering. So how do we bridge this? What are the opportunities and what's your thinking, Catherine?
Thanks, Dennis. I think that this panel was your way of heightening the contradictions and getting some resolution, which I actually think that the folks here on this panel, I feel like we have some work to do between now and next year. Because I do feel like I do focus on climate data. I work at the Stanford Law School Center for Legal Informatics and focus on climate data policy. I'm an attorney by training, but I'm also a planner and a person who understands that at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is change people's lives for the better. And so that's why the Innovation Hub was so attractive to me, because I see so few places where it's not either or, but a both and. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to say, when I listen to the two Eriks and Gustav, I do feel like we need both climate, we need a climate and need fulfillment KPIs. We need a framework that allows us to balance both the impacts on climate and the impacts on people's lives. And I think that that siloed work can be brought together, and we can use new data tools to allow us to be energized and informed, and also appropriate to local context. Because I do think, especially when it comes to shelter, that is such a personal and deeply cultural and contextual experience. And I think that there is no one size fits all. And so some people may want to wear sweaters and some may not. And what we have to do is more deeply understand and sort of radically collaborate on the ground to develop the real behavioral insights that can guide us in allocating resources. So I'm going to talk just briefly, because Dennis, has asked me to talk about GHG accounting, and then how do we get from where we are with GHG accounting to a more holistic approach. And I think I would say that let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Carbon intensity does matter. And I would also say consumer intensity matters. And I think that we have to create a larger framework for solution making. When I think about this expanded dialogue and data to support a needs-based value solutions, I look at GHG accounting, and right now, we have these NDCs, we have non-state actors with their climate pledges, whether those are cities or businesses, and I will agree with Dennis that really has sort of been the way in which people talk about whether they're making progress or not. I would say that there are tools for us to use that we just need to kind of focus on and make better when it comes to climate data accounting. I think the avoided emissions framework is important, and the GHG protocol has a policy and action framework which says that you cannot really understand the substitution activities without looking at a range of dynamics. That we need to understand contextually what are people's desires, what will they do differently, what won't they. And so I think we can take those frameworks and, under the auspices of the UGIH, the Innovation Hub, really make them much more dynamic. When it comes to consumption-based accounting, that gets talked about a lot, which is let's look at what individuals consume, and that is a powerful way in which to move away from production-based accounting. But we have to look at consumption-based accounting. My main sort of critique right now is that we get so focused on a baseline that we never get to solution making in it. And I think that gets to one of the biggest, criticisms I have right now, which is that we are really focused on granular data in many contexts where it just doesn't exist. So I really think that fit for purpose data would be the way in which I would think about the conversation, and that as we build these data sets that Erik's talking about, we need to also overlay what is the purpose of data, what are we using it to create carbon credits, or are we using it to create new options that we're going to test. And I think that fit for purpose data is the next imperative. We don't have the resources, especially in the global south, to recreate a lot of the European smart city approach, that's highly, it's fun to watch the digital twins, but you realize that we have to make this scale. So I'm looking forward to new data sets that are really about human behavioral insights, needs and capacities, and a new way of attributing impact that includes climate as well as need fulfillment. And I think by next year, we should have take some of these data collaboratives and really leverage them with AI and other next-gen technologies to give us and give communities a much better set of tools to make in creating a better life for themselves. So Dennis, those are some thoughts for me about the both and really excited about your panel.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I think this, as you highlighted, and the whole idea with Expand Innovation Agenda is that don't throw out the old things that's done. It's not bad that companies and cities has taken on reduction commitments, trying to find that data. Data is never bad in itself. It's how you aggregate it and the kind of incentives it's create. And that's where I think we have to a little bit of rethinking, as you said. It's been a little bit too much on compliance and reduction and little on solution providers. And it's not that the data's fault, it's how we aggregated it and presented it. If we take the same data and just rejig it, it's an opportunity for people to step up and provide those solutions. But we only have a few minutes left, and I'd actually like to Erik Schultes, because Catherine provided a bit of an information and thinking about how do you get the current climate data into the next phase. If you can talk a little bit about your broader sort of, because most of the data out there today is not being thought of as climate data, and the work you do in Go Fair, for instance, if you can just end by a few notes on the broader data collection in society and how we can bring this human needs-driven data sets, everything from the sensors needed to collect that data and the personal interaction that is needed to get a human face of the data, but also on the right to own and to have fair data. So if you can just wrap up in 2 minutes or so.
Sure, Dennis. And it's funny that you should bring this up because I actually, during the discussion, I wrote down the World Fair project. I included a link to that in the chat, so maybe some of you can see it. So yeah, I'm working for an organization called the Go Fair Foundation. FAIR is an acronym that is data and services that are made findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable by computers. So on behalf of humans for sure, but really it's about automating these FA-INR functions. And it involves not just sort of technical solutions and kind of bigger, better computers, but it also involves a kind of a cultural shift in the way people, we would say, steward their data, the way they create it, the way the policies around it, and how they choose to describe in metadata and the vocabularies that they have, how they describe these assets. When these things can be rendered machine readable, and it's a complicated process, but with emerging solutions. When these data can be rendered fair, more and more the machine can assist in, for example, the cross-domain interoperability of data. So if we had, what we think of as traditionally climate data, say CO2 levels coming off of sensors that are floating on buoys in the ocean or on mountaintops, that those data streams can be factored in to industrial growth and industrial activity data in a meaningful way, right? So if these data were rendered fair, the machine could be doing this more and more on its own, and could be offering to people some integrated collections of data that might make more sense when it comes to really looking for innovative solutions on these problems. At the moment, a lot of this work is done manually because we don't really use controlled vocabularies. We don't have machine actionable metadata. And so the human has to constantly be at the interface, and that's just not scalable. So the Go Fair Foundation has as its mission to really find scalable solutions to making data fair. That involves a cultural shift in the way we do data science, but it really promises then revolutionary outcomes in the way that we can use data and repurpose it for other things. I'll just mention that we had 3 weeks ago in Leiden, where I'm based, the first meeting of the FAIR Digital Object Conference. Is an international conference, and the people that attended and gave keynotes were actually the founders of the internet itself. So there's really an anticipation that making data fair is really going to deploy a whole new layer to the internet, where machines are much more autonomous and can move around and process data on the behalf of humans. So I hope that addresses partly what you were asking for, Dennis.
Absolutely, Erik. Thanks a lot. And I think, as I said before, I really hope that we can have a dedicated data day next year to really dive into these questions about who owns the data, because we also see what can be called as data colonialism today. Rich countries and companies come into the global south, collecting lots of data and take that data, not share with that data with the population. So, and as you know, Tim Berners-Lee and many people who created the internet are so frustrated with the walls that everything from Facebook to Amazon is putting up and taking the data and making it commercial. Even though it's individual data, we give our data, but that data might be able to use for the global goods, not just to sell us products and services. So we need a fundamental discussion about who owns our data and what data is being used. So if we don't do that, the way we provide shelter and global human needs will never be for our goods. It will be for someone else. So I'll just like to end with that and thank the panel for a fantastic contribution. And it's an odd combination, but I hope we will see more of the sort of giant scientists and practitioners that actually provide new innovative solutions coming together, because only then can we bridge that gap, as Catherine was saying. How do we build on the old and then bring in the new? So please give a round of applause to the fantastic panel.